The Dingometer, where we tackle tricky issues in learning design and uncover the factors that produce awesome learning experiences. As always, I'm delighted to have Phil with me in the hot seat. Welcome, Phil.
Hello, thank you. Hello, Tony. How are you?
I hope the seat is not too hot.
No, the seat's fine actually. I am wearing my hat. It's actually a bit cold here, to be honest. So.
All right. So the title of today's session is how bad practice produces good learning, and this came out of, funnily enough, our handy almanac, which is
Sorry, can I just stop you there? Is that our almanac that's available now in all good bookshops? Well, actually on Amazon.
it is. It's a very large bookshop.
It is a very large bookshop.
But yeah, so I was going through this, and it was one of the postcards that our dean colleague, Dr. Nicholas, had written, and it was about learning from bad examples.
Mm-hmm.
It's taught all over the world, and in the almanac it says, "As always, I'm learning the most from a bad example," and it just got me thinking, because this came up a lot when I was running a teacher training course, which was always the problem that you wanted to show how not to do something, but ethically that was problematic because you couldn't take a real example of someone delivering a terrible teaching session and then say, this is not how you do it, let's pick holes in it. But you still had to convey the sense to the learners that you didn't want to do it badly, but you were always talking about good. So there was this weird sort of gap in the middle. So we thought it was useful because obviously some of the work that we've done recently has tried to get into this gap, hasn't it, around leading with bad practice. So I don't know what your thoughts on that, Phil, in terms of like how we start to, well, let's go back to like Schadenfreude and this idea of what that means. Why are we fascinated by bad practice, first of all?
I think, I mean, there's probably some very clever psychologists out there who will talk about sort of why the mammalian brain enjoys the displeasure of others. It's probably something to do with, pack mentality, or sort of like the runt of the litter, or something terribly depressing. But I've always understood Schadenfreude as being something that is one of those black market social things that everybody understands and has an example of, but you're not really allowed to talk about it because we're sort of meant to be more elevated human beings. When someone falls over, we're not meant to laugh. We're meant to sort of rush, and our empathy is meant to be activated. And we talk a lot about empathy and the idea that Schadenfreude is kind of its evil twin, because in a sense it is totally connected to how we see ourselves in someone else and how we sort of align ourselves with someone. But in this instance, we're going, well, I'm glad I'm not them, and I'm glad that's not happening to me. So I find those two things very fascinating. But between you and me, as a experienced educator and as someone who spent a lot of time in rooms with many people, watching an expression of something that's being done badly, I can tell you now that I know, as a sort of pragmatist, as a sort of an educator who was desperately trying to create a change with people, that I knew when someone doing something badly was having an incredibly positive effect on the rest of the room. So I don't want to sort of get into the ethics of like the bad or good of that. I want to just get into the truth of the fact that after that session, I would look around and see that the conversations were people kind of thinking, okay, well, I'm not going to do that next time, or I see that didn't go down very well, so I'm going to sort of do something different. And it seemed to me that there was always this back channel, like a learning design back channel, if you like, that was based around people using worst practice and kind of disasters to very positive advantage. And so I think it is an interesting terrain to talk about, because I think it is also a terrain that would make some people in the business of learning design and education uncomfortable, because I can imagine people worrying about whether there's like a shaming dimension, or the ethics of it and all of that kind of stuff. And yet nonetheless, as a phenomena, it's there. It is something I think that people broadly understand, and it might be a tool. It might be something that can be used positively. And I'd be interested to know what your thoughts about that, about the idea that bad practice can be a tool to produce transformations in other people. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. That in terms of learning, that's where it's really interesting because, yeah, on the one hand, Schadenfreude is about, I think the definition is benefiting from others' misfortune, which is obviously not something that you want to promote. But as you've said, in many ways, as a species, we're hardwired to look at misfortune because that's how we learn. We don't want to mess things up. When, if you look at it at an existential level, I suppose if, someone gets hit by a bus or someone falls off a cliff, then you look at that and go, that wasn't great. Let's not do that. So I think as a species, we have an ingrained survival mechanism, which is like fear of what wrong looks like.
Hmm.
But I think if you bring that through into learning, there's something really powerful about, and it taps into failure. I think people are afraid to fail, as we know, because no one likes to fail. But if you can lead with worst practice or lead with a bad example, in some ways, I think it lets learners off the hook because they're like, oh, thank goodness, someone did it really badly, and that's okay. There's not this sort of bubble of perfection that they have to aim for. It's like that's what terrible looks like. It gives them permission to fail. It gives them the kind of the breathing space to go, okay, that was terrible. I can probably do a bit better than that. So in some ways, it leading with bad practice makes success feel a little bit more tangible, perhaps. I think.
Yeah, I think that we've had a few um, tertiary conversations during our various podcasts around the power of vulnerability. Particularly when a more knowledgeable other, so called, maybe leads with when they were experiencing a problem around a particular threshold concept or around something that instantly you can see the room breathe out and almost walk towards the problem with a little bit more pleasure, as opposed to feeling repelled by a difficult problem. So I think that there is an aligned idea here about vulnerability. Now, I think this is where the ethics issue is because obviously someone who is crashing and burning is vulnerable. And I think, there's a whole world out there we know around social media and people being cancelled for saying the wrong thing in the wrong situation. So I think in a way, I think the stakes never been higher for people around bad practice. Like bad practice can sort of be incredibly damaging, can't it, to you professionally and sort of all and sort of emotionally. And so I just want to be clear that I don't think we're talking about that. And maybe the quickest way to sort of get into that distinction really would be to talk about something that we have done, some of the project work that we've done, which almost required us to lead with bad practice and sort of produce Schadenfreude to a positive effect. So I don't know if you want to sort of set the scene for the work we did relatively recently around trying to get people ready for the workplace and for the challenges of the workplace, and particularly the challenges around working with other people in a team. So I don't know if you want to set the scene a little bit for sort of the
Yeah,
gap that we were asked to fill.
yeah, very much so. And just before I do that, I wanted to add that there was a lot of this was based on some really interesting research. It was a longitudinal study done a couple of years ago by a couple of researchers called Sinha and Kapoor, which was into research into leading with a problem, and they did it across multiple disciplines. It was a big study, and they found that they compared teachers who taught before presenting a problem with teachers who presented a problem and then taught, and they found that if you led with a problem and you didn't provide any teaching until students had experienced something difficult, that the learning gain was about 20% higher. So there was real value in learning terms in terms of grappling with the unknown or grappling with something unfamiliar before you teach into it. And as you say, when we started to do this work for it was the project around how to build a suite of courses for data trainees, but the key aim of the course or the experience was to prepare people for the workplace. And through the conversations with the subject matter expert, it transpired that there were lots of terrible examples of what ineffective, or lots of good examples of what ineffective data analysts look like. People who didn't talk to one another, people who didn't get out of their chair, people who just put their headphones on and got buried in their work, and people who couldn't see the wider business. And so through those early conversations, it started to crystallize that actually there was a lot of valuable learning to be had in how not to do it. And the person we were working with had some fantastic stories about, I remember when I worked with a person like that, they were really talented, but they were terrible at going and meeting with people, or they were great at meeting with people and terrible at doing any work. So we use that as a basis to start to fictionalize or bring together those true experiences into some form of fiction. And this is where I think we learned a huge amount through doing this piece of work in terms of the value of fictionalizing bad practice, so that the bad practice is drawn from real examples. So it's a sort of a collated wisdom that this is what bad looks like, but we're not shining a light specifically on it. We're going to produce something. In this case, it was a 4-part video miniseries of what these weaknesses look like, or these deficits look like in people. But it was a real balancing act, wasn't it? Because there's a real danger if you're leading with bad practice to just point a finger at someone and go, "That's bad. Don't do it like that." And actually, through the process of building those scenarios, building that miniseries, something came out that was much more nuanced. Which I know you did a lot of work on the scripts, and I fell into the trap, actually. Interestingly, when you said read the script, and I went, "Oh yeah, that person's terrible. You know that. Why would you employ that person?" And you went, "Well, hang on. It's not quite like that." So maybe it'd be interesting if you could just elaborate a little bit on how you found that line between not just using bad practice as a something to throw tomatoes at and say, "Yeah, don't do it like that." How did you find that nuance? What did that look like?
Well, it was all really to do with the brief. And the brief, essentially, as you've iterated, was we were working with a subject matter expert who was very clear that in terms of the design, the curriculum that we were designing and developing to sort of solve this particular problem out there in the real world, that was absolutely these young people needed to have their data literacy, and they needed to have all of those things. They also needed to have an experience of what it was to enter the slightly less well articulated terrain of the workplace. And so the brief really was to enhance that sensitivity around what it's like to be with people, and all of that brings. And as you've said as well, in talking to the subject matter expert, he was able to sort of list all of these behaviors, which, whilst not totally self-sabotaging, were in the context of teamwork, produced obstacles. So it wasn't about, aren't these people ridiculous? It's what happens to these traits when they are in the context of teamwork, when those traits are working against the idea of the team and also the needs of the business and all of those things. So in that respect, it was already a nuanced brief, in so much it wasn't look at these idiots. It was look at this team struggling with sort of excessive traits, that and so. But the point of producing this fictional thing, we essentially produced a fictional documentary that was ostensibly filmed by a fictional company to train data analysts. And what actually happens is that as this documentary plays out, the wheels start to fall off the training program. So it's a training program that sort of starts to self-sabotage. And in that moment is when it becomes a learning resource for the actual students who were part of this program. And as you rightly say, it would have been easy to produce a kind of a bunch of punch bags. But we also knew that how these learning resources were going to be used is they were going to be used as generators of discussion. So they were 10-minute webisodes, if you like, 10-minute videos, and then they'd be watched by the actual students, and then the students would then be invited and be facilitated to talk about what they observed and what they noticed. So in that respect, it was so important that the conversation didn't go like this: "Well, that person's incompetent," because incompetence is almost like is as unhelpful an idea as perfection, because it's sort of like it's too much of a primary color.
Yeah.
So our job to produce these proper learning resources was to ensure that everybody who was behaving on screen in a particular way, who were manifesting traits that the SME had said produce obstacles for teamwork, that you understood their motivation. In a way, it's like any other piece of writing, sort of fiction, is that you need to ensure that even characters that you dislike or that you don't recognize, you understand their motivation. So this issue, this sort of ethical issue around kind of producing epitomes of bad practice, the really important thing around all of that was producing well-rounded personas who were also shown over the course of the film to able to learn and to reflect. So in that respect, that was where I suppose I felt and you felt that learning design vibe playing out in the writing, because we had to create these arcs where these characters did learn something. But, let's not get away from it. The real value of these videos, I think, for the learners on this course, as you say, was it enabled them to see behaviors that were not their own, but which perhaps privately they were thinking, I do recognize that a bit, or I have seen that play out. And it meant everybody could talk about the behavior as opposed to people being silenced by that example of poor practice. So the fictive part of it is absolutely key, but it's the fiction that's born from what is true. So, and that's really important. It's like it's a real world problem being presented productively and constructively through fictionalizing it. Really, that's what we did, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where it really opened up some interesting areas for learning, because once we've managed to identify the traits, fictionalize those into recognized characters, it was then possible to create a whole wealth of teaching out of that. So we were sort of creating a whole week's worth of discussions, or using those personas and those episodes to frame the weekly activity, to say, okay, what does this represent? And the key question was, why is this person acting in that way? And as you say, not to just look at them and go, they're incompetent, which is a really easy get out. Is to say, well, actually, if we look at that and go, all right, there's clearly some benefits and challenges here to their behavior, but let's pull back a bit and look at it and go, well, what might have produced those? Maybe that person is under pressure. Why are they under pressure? Turns out that person wasn't being particularly well managed in terms of the time management. Another person was very focused on a particular thing at the expense of others. That highlighted issues of neurodiversity and how people might think and work differently, and how it's easy to just ignore that and go, well, they're not very good at integrating with the team, and getting into that blame culture. So I think this is where the fiction really started to produce very practical learning activities that you could teach into, because you could open up a whole hour, 2 hour discussion around what are the factors that might have produced the conditions for this person to be behaving in the way that they're behaving. And that is so transferable, because it doesn't matter whether you're working in an office or a university or wherever. We know, and we've all seen what good and bad looks like. And obviously good and bad are very subjective, but everyone's got examples of what they think somebody performing well and somebody performing badly looks like. And I think if you were to look at practical ways to perhaps reproduce this, one interesting place to start would be to interview people about their own views on what good and bad examples of, or what examples of bad practice look like. And once you've got a sort of you start to get this sort of selection of stories and anecdotes, which is, I suppose, how we approached it, then you start to develop personas out of those, so that you can then produce scenarios. But I mean, what was the process that you went through to do that? Because there was there's sort of 4 10-minute episodes, so there was quite a lot of material in there. But how did you get to that point where you could sort of get to the nuanced character? How did you sort
Well,
of?
I mean, I'll say that because obviously my background is in. So I live for fiction. I think that fiction is the way in which the world is presented back to us in ways that is meaningful. So I absolutely love a documentary, and I don't mind reading a book written about an actual person. But I can honestly say that my most profound changes, my insights into people, my empathy, I think, has been developed as much as by fiction as by anything else, because you can read a book or watch a TV show about a world that you're not part of. But if the writing, if the insights are real and good, you will be drawn in and you will learn. So I know that there's an apparent paradox between the idea of fiction being able to tell the truth, and we are indefinitely sort of, people say, oh, we're a bit post-truth, so I don't want to get anyone confused around what I'm talking about. I think I'm talking about the power of fiction to give us insights into why people behave in the way that they do, as opposed to reality as a fiction. I'm not, for anyone who's listening, that's not what I'm talking about. So for that reason, I've fictionalizing these anecdotes was instinctive, but also it meant that you had a responsibility to the characters to ensure that they weren't caricatures and that they were sort of. But I will say that that is essentially when I think about my experience as an educationalist, as someone who educates and has worked with a lot of young people, I would absolutely say that that needs to understand character and that need to understand people's motivations, that instinct to empathize. Maybe it's got nothing to do with fiction. Maybe it's got everything to do with being someone who's interested in learning and interested in sort of education. Because for me, when I was sort of in the truth of my job, when I was watching perhaps learners behave in interesting ways or have repeat behaviors, I was always fascinated and interested in trying to get to their backstory, like why, and so I could feel myself playing when I was writing these characters for this learning resource. I suppose I was drawing upon teaching as much as fiction. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think I was drawing upon like, wow, this person's hostile to this idea. Either we agree that there are people who are just unpleasant or objectionable. But actually, I've met very few unpleasant and objectionable people who are that through like a stick of rock. It's always about those behaviors are often like a data set connected to an experience, and it's about trying to figure those things out. So practically, I would say that as the to sort of build and design this learning resource, it was always thinking about the likely discussions that it would produce. So ensuring that there was sufficient nuance and sufficient discursive elements in their behaviors, which would actually create learning in the real room with the real people. So in that respect, it wasn't entertainment in its own right. It was meant to be a really well-designed resource designed to produce an effect in a room with actual learners. And I would say that's the case of a really good slide deck, a project brief, a presentation. That's what, in some respects it was no different. It was kind of wonderful to work fictionally, but I wouldn't suggest it was a huge difference to the job we would do anywhere else in that way.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because I know for us it was a new challenge to work on a data program, because both you and I are from creative arts backgrounds, and suddenly to be designing a data course initially was like, wow, this is going to be a bit different. But what was fascinating for me was as those shared stories began to emerge, there was something incredibly human about that you realize was relevant to absolutely every discipline, as whether you're working in data, HR, construction, architecture, that you will have a set of stories, and other people in that discipline will have a set of similar stories of people that they've experienced or projects where things went well or didn't go well. That is the sort of it's not the hidden curriculum of that discipline, but it's the kind of the folklore, isn't it?
Well, I want to say, in a way, I would say that one of my big insights from working on that project was a slightly sort of it was like a Damascene moment that was also a bit like duh, because sometimes when in terms of learning design or whatever, sometimes there is a temptation to sort of abstract knowledge, or your every discipline, every subject, whatever it is, it sort of has this crunchy concrete syllabus or whatever. But actually it's all around human behaviors, and you sort of realize that and this brings us right back to the beginning, I think, of the discussion, that human behaviors will facilitate or block learning. So you've got the syllabus, you've got the learning design, you've got what you hope is going to happen in the room, you've got how you hope people are going to behave, and then that idea burns up on reality when it contacts
Why?
human beings. And I think anyone who's not interested in stories is going to struggle to understand what's happening in a learning context, because people bring their stories to the knowledge, and that's why learning's amazing, because different people arrive at the same thing and will synthesize a different result, and that's where new knowledge comes from, and that's amazing. That's best practice. But if we go right back to sort of, bad practice is simply a word, I think, or the expression of behaviors, is when when people meet a moment of learning and it challenges them or provokes them, or they struggle, or there's a trigger. And often, sort of like when I think about sort of like back in my teaching life, people who were very bad at presenting, or people who were sort of very bad at one of the things the course required them to do, I think if you decided that them being bad at it was the end of the discussion, then you've got a problem. But if you decide that it's the beginning of the discussion, you must be able to talk about poor practice. You must be able to move into that space. You must be able to confront what didn't go well, and you must have the confidence to understand that there is a space after that where you think people can do things better. So I don't think it's you can get sometimes into that relative place where there is no best practice. There's just people's expressions of their knowledge, whatever. And that can be true, obviously. But if you start looking at things like learning outcomes and workplace expectations, and the expectations of professional disciplines and certain traits that people have to have in order to be successful, I think you have a responsibility as a learning designer to lead with problems, to name those problems, and to do it with confidence. And that's not the same as saying you're rubbish, or I can't believe you can't do this. It's the beginning of something, and I've always felt that we have to be confident to ask for what we want around behaviors as they relate to expectations that come with particular disciplines or sectors and all of those things. Because if the learning designers are going to do it, then I'm telling you, someone else less sensitive and less nuanced is going to do that job.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, someone else is just waiting over there to shame you or to make that experience much, much more destructive.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. That just makes me think that like you say, this going back to the value of leading with the problem. If you look at what happens when you don't lead with the problem, often you lead with decontextualized knowledge, because it's very easy to just then walk into teaching. I'm going to teach you a bunch of stuff that you may or may not be familiar with to whatever degree. But if you think about when learners first get together, often for the first time, often they've got no shared experiences. And so you as an educator or a facilitator don't really know what's in the room. You don't know where those people have come from. You don't know their level of understanding, experience. And if you start teaching into that, it's like water on the desert. You don't know how much of it's going to make any difference or no difference. But actually, if you lead with a problem, then in many ways, you're creating a shared experience that everyone's gone, oh, we all experienced that same problem together, whether that's a video or an activity or a problem.
Yeah.
And once you've had that shared experience, you can then teach into it much more effectively, because everyone's experienced that same thing, even if it was for a few moments, and they've got that shared experience. So you're all referring to the same thing rather than hoping that people will be able to make sense of what you're talking about, I think.
I've always felt, I mean, I know we're nearly done, but I've always felt that certainly, and this is a big subject to open up at the end, so maybe we'll just leave it hanging. But I do think some of this dovetails with inclusivity and sort of the presentations of inclusivity, in so much as that I've always felt that it's not terribly inclusive to not allude or lead with poor practices as they relate to real world expectations, because that feels like that education, particularly educational spaces, are complicit in keeping people excluded, though the people who are being excluded don't know it yet, but they'll know it soon. And I think leading with a problem in that way, and doing it with great sensitivity, doing it sort of perhaps fictively, but also just saying it how it is, can be very powerful. But obviously, it's the beginning. The point about what we did with those videos is that it was the learning resource to produce an effect with learners. It was a calibrated, nuanced, careful piece of design. So all I would say is that I've always thought this about education is you can do what you want, um, but you have to do what you want in the knowledge of the effect you want to produce in the room. And that is where you need to be completely responsible. You need to be ethical, and you need to be confident that the reason you are presenting it like this is because this knowledge is important and necessary and transformational, and also that it's benchmarking against learning outcomes. Because if you're just having a session on something that bothers you, if you're just having a session on a something that you don't like about what people do, and it's got nothing to do with the curricula and nothing to do with the intellectual enterprise of the course, then what are you doing?
Yeah, a cautionary tale to end on. Always make sure that whatever you're building refers. That's like the bit that they say at the end, isn't it? Always make sure that everything you build refers to your learning outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. Because otherwise you do then move into a terrain where you could be producing sort of shame um, or unintended consequences, even if you're trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So just tread carefully. But if you're a good learning designer, I think that you can really use leading with a problem and fiction and sort of like the worst excesses of a situation to really transformative and positive effect, I think.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good place to end. So if you're listening, get out there and have a go at using some fiction. Fiction is a very powerful way to produce the effects that you're looking for in your learners.
And it is also an answer to some of the ethical dimensions around
Yeah.
how do you use humans as teaching resources, as learning resources? How do you create like a safari park? How do you sort of produce that sort of experience without laughing at anyone in particular, but really sort of trying to sort of bring out behaviors which in particular contexts can be inappropriate, and sort of reduce people's chances for success. That was all that was the game we were in, Tony, which was to sort of present those behaviors as obstacles to really effective teamwork in the specific context of a business that needed specific outcomes from that team. And that was where all of those behaviors were sort of aligned with, and that was where those learning resources were their most useful.
Really useful. Yeah, I love
Yeah.
the idea of the human safari park. I think that is, we need more of that in learning.
Well, we do live in a safari park, right? We know it's called the world. So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. On that note, if you want more insights about learning design, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. We do these events every Friday, so you can find them on our YouTube channel and also on LinkedIn. And tune in next week for more deep insights into learning design, fiction, and human safari parks.
Excellent. All right.